The finale is the only one of the four movements that begins in a very confident and stable way. It begins like this. Now all of the other movements, they begin with something that moves them forward. But now, after this dramatic climax of the third movement, the music is finally ready to settle itself, so to say, and that's why it begins like this. What follows is a slow passage played by the first violins alone. It sounds very careful. They're playing a scale. And every time they play, they include one more note. And the scale that they're playing is the same scale as the one we had at the beginning of the third movement. Exactly the same notes. Now the point of the third movement was to push itself upwards and forwards all the time, and therefore there were all these alterations to the scale. All these alterated notes, the first of them being F sharp. What happens now when he's carefully tasting this material once again is that he reaches F natural. So now at this point, F natural wants to resolve downwards towards E, and that's exactly what it does. So at this point we are over the struggle. The music is no longer stretching itself forward, it's simply enjoying itself. This is pure joy. The music is flowing freely in a very fast tempo. It's very fresh and jubilant, and it's like a celebration after having gone through the drama, gone through the trouble. Also these scales, at this point they're no longer stretching themselves out into something. They're no longer on their way towards something. And also this. These scales are not going towards anything. They're simply there, and they simply, well, add more enjoyment to the music. Generally, everything is very much based around scales in this movement. We have lots of passages where scales are going up and down between one another. We have, for instance, there's a passage here, beginning at bar 38. Where not only are they scales, but they also, every time they're repeated, they're a scale degree lower. At the end of this line of scales, we get down to this dominant to G major, and we now get a rising scale in the bass. It's very characteristic for this movement that rising and falling scales and rising and falling motifs take over from one another very quickly. Sometimes they're even on top of each other. And this makes the music extra lively. One element that I particularly like is the timpani at bar 30, which plays. It's almost like a solo at this point, like a timpani solo. And it's also an element which is not really connected to anything around it. So again, it's very free. It's a very free way of writing at this point. It's part of the energy of the movement to have a little timpani solo also like this. This movement is where it's a place where we can see that Beethoven owes a lot to Haydn, because this is the type of movement that could have been the finale of a Haydn symphony. It's very much in this style, this kind of joyful freshness. The form is sonata form with an extended coda, and we can just turn to the second theme for a bit. It begins at bar 56. So the second theme is joyful and playful, and it has this half-step motif again. And then it's repeated, and when it's repeated, it's taken up one scale degree. And when it's played the second time, it's changed. So the first time we have the half step, the changing step, on the upbeat into the beat. And then the second note is repeated. But in the second phrase, the half step is in the appoggiatura on the beat. And it's the first note which is repeated. So it's a very free way of working. It's the music is no longer strictly bound by its form. There's room for this kind of play. And having little motifs like that and using them in this kind of way also makes the music very playful combined with this bass. It's rather like really simple dance music. Also, the second phrase, since the changing step is now an appoggiatura, it adds a little bit of dissonance, after which the music now begins to rise all the way up to this diminished chord. The end of the exposition sounds like this. And we have this motif, which is reminiscent of a motif that we had in the third movement. But again, in the fourth movement, the music is not struggling any longer, so this motif has been transformed. Because of the rhythm and the accompaniment and its placement in the form, in the third movement, it's very wild. And it's pushing forward. But in the fourth movement, it's much more stable and settled. And it's interesting to observe how the same idea can appear in many places, but every time it's changed to give a different impression, depending on how the form is developing, and thereby it contributes to the music in many different ways. Then, in the development section, this motif is repeated. Every time the motif is repeated, it's again one scale degree higher. It's played piano, there's space between the repetitions. The music is carefully awaiting, where are we going now? And where we go is where this A, which is played at the end of the violin scales and repeated many times, is finally resolved into B flat major, again by going up a half step. Then we modulate over to F major and follows a passage where we have a lot of these very fast scales that go in opposite directions and take over from each other quickly. And so on. And we get little motifs. And all this takes us through the circle of fifth, back into C major. Then in C major, we get this passage once again, which we heard in the exposition, played in the dominant key when we were on our way to the second theme. Here it appears in the tonic key, which is how it is supposed to appear in the reprise. But the only thing is we haven't gotten to the reprise yet. We haven't heard the main theme of the reprise. And when we do in fact get to the reprise, this passage is entirely omitted. So it's simply picked out of the reprise and placed before it. And this has some reference to the Sonata Rondos by Mozart, where he sometimes flips the themes in the reprise. And it certainly makes the form much freer. And it's the kind of liberty that you, at this time in history, can only take in a finale after you have already had some more strict movements. In the reprise, he rather unusually reintroduces the second theme in the subdominant key of F major. And then, also rather unusually, modulates back to C major halfway through. And this is again making the form of the movement more free. Towards the end of the reprise, we get this passage. This is the only place where the pulse stops. These two fermatas are like a final call for attention before the ending. And well, it's quite interesting, the material here, because what happens is we get scales, either diatonic or chromatic, rising and falling, and they're played out against each other, these two movements in opposite direction. And the C that they begin from stays. And only at the end is there a change. And do you remember, towards the end of the first movement, we also had scales in opposite directions played out against one another. There was the first movement, and then the second. So it seems to be a thing, like a recurring thing in the symphony. It does not happen in the third movement though, but it is a recurring thing that towards the end of movements he plays out scales in opposite directions against each other. And in a way this is a simplification of what has been going on all the time, because throughout the whole symphony we had all these scales that are moving up and moving down. We have little half-step motifs and whole-step motifs that are also moving up and down. And the music is made of all of this being flipped around in lots of different ways. And this is like a simplification of that principle. And therefore it functions in a way like a conclusion of our material. It's where all of the ideas come together in their most simplified form. But then after this, the music just continues as before. This is now the coda, and in here the theme is played once more, after which follows some 20 bars before the final cadence. And in these 20 bars, the music is only using the same harmonies as in the final 4 bars of the theme. Used again and again. So the music is by all means simplifying itself and getting ready to end. Also at this point Beethoven uses almost only terraced dynamics. Now unexpectedly the music changes very drastically between piano and forte, which also helps breaking up the flow of the music and also thereby brings us closer towards an ending. In fact, there's only one crescendo, which is from bar 283 till 287, and they are like, it's like a final push that leads us into the final cadence, after which we land firmly in C major. And then the final 16 bars are, just like in the ending of the first movement, a big celebration of the C major chord. Though with one little twist at the very end, which is dominant, tonic, one final time punching out our half-step motif like a conclusion.